I'd like to now introduce Dr. Marc Gaden from the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, who is actually friend and mentor, and I've been working with Marc for almost 20 years in my former position at the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. But enough about me. Marc has spent, he's from Michigan, and he spent most of his professional career working to protect and improve the North American Great Lakes. He currently serves as the Communications Director and Legislative Liaison at the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, which is a US-Canadian agency established by treaty to improve and perpetuate the Great Lakes fishery, which we'll be discussing more about. He's held that position since 1995, and he's worked extensively on issues involving regional coordination of fisheries policies, invasive species, sorry, my notes got mixed up. Prior to joining the Great Lakes Fishery Commission Secretariat, Marc worked as a legislative assistant in the U.S. House of Representatives Great Lakes Task Force, researching, proposing and advocating legislation to benefit the North American Great Lakes region. He's also worked as a legislative assistant and caseworker for U.S. congressmen, especially on Great Lakes environment, transportation, immigration, and social security issues. He's currently also an adjunct professor at the University of Michigan and Michigan State University. His research and teaching interests relate to the human dimensions of natural resource management, very applicable to all of the work that we've been doing. And currently he teaches the course Global Water at the University of Michigan program in the environment. He received his PhD at the University of Michigan, Masters of Arts at the United States Foreign Policy United States Foreign Policy from the American University, and a BA also from the University of Michigan. So a long introduction, but Marc, thank you so much for joining us today. Very excited to have you here.
Oh, thank you very much. And I hope you can see my screen. Give me a thumbs up if that's a yes. Okay,
yep.
Good.
We're good.
I am coming to you from the University of Michigan. My class that I teach in the fall about global water issues just ended about an hour ago, and so another semester is under my belt. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. I see the people on the screen there, and some of whom I know and some of whom I've not had the pleasure of meeting. And you'll see a theme in my presentation about relationships and trust and how important it is. And I look forward to meeting everyone here someday. It is critical, and we will get back to normal. And once that happens, we'll be able to resume really all the work that TED and ACARE and so many others have been doing over the years and decades to keep these communities of practice alive and well. And it all depends on personal relationships. I'm a student of history, so you'll note my presentation is about how you get from competition to cooperation. So there'll be a good dose of history and how we got there in the Great Lakes region. That's what I'm going to talk about today. And it's a case study really of how we got from what we call diffuse or divided governance to where we are today with a cooperative regime to manage the North American Great Lakes. Divided governance is a term that I'll use, or diffuse governance, or just cross-border governance. But we have an issue in the Great Lakes in that the international border goes through 4 of the 5 Great Lakes, with Canada being here, the United States being here, of course, but also then the province of Ontario covering 4 of the 5 Great Lakes, and 8 US states bordering 4 of the 5 Great Lakes. And now on the US side of the border, there's also 3 intertribal organizations, which indigenous tribes that also have management authority in the Great Lakes. What's important about the Great Lakes is that the management of the fishery is a subnational responsibility. It's not a federal responsibility. So the province of Ontario, for all intents and purposes, manages the Great Lakes its share of the fishery in terms of everything that you imagine that management to be, issuing regulations, deciding who can fish where and when and for how many and how large and what the open and closed seasons will be and so on. And on the United States side, it's exactly the same for slightly different reasons, but nevertheless, the individual states manage that, even though it is a shared binational resource. And then since the 1980s, the tribes, which their headquarters are shown, have authority as well in their ceded waters. These are under treaties of the 1800s. In Canada, it's a little different with the indigenous, and I don't have time to go into it. But suffice it to say that fishery management is a subnational responsibility. And that means that the states and the province and the tribes are behaving in a way like independent nations on the lakes. So you talk about in Lake Victoria, for example, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda working together. In the United States and Canada, it's those two governments, but really Ontario, the 8 states, and the tribes. This divided governance led to no end of problems pretty much since the days of European colonization in the 1700s, and certainly with the emergence of massive commercial fishing in the 1800s. By the turn of the last century, so late 1800s, 1880s, 1890s, there was, I'll call it prevalent parochialism. Say that 3 times fast. Prevalent parochialism in the Great Lakes Basin, where the province of Ontario and the 8 Great Lakes states were behaving very much with parochial interests in mind. Commercial fishing was 3 drivers really driving it. Were ever expanding commercial fishery. And that's documented very well in this book by Margaret Beatty Bogue, if anyone's read this book. If you want to get a good understanding of the fishery, commercial fishing from the era late 1700s to the early 1900s, this book is really the best volume that I know of. And she described this ever-expanding, wasteful, modern commercial fishery that really led to the loss of many of the, and really overfishing of many of the Great Lakes species. That was on top of the fact that science was at a premium. A lot of the data was the people who were making decisions, they were relying on actually the commercial fishers themselves to provide those data. Any surveys that they did of the fishery, they meaning governments, were ad hoc or really a big deal. Like it took an act of the legislatures to come up with money and all that. And really there was that low science capacity led to bad behavior. It led to a paucity of regulations. It led to the jurisdictions basically using a lack of information as an excuse not to issue regulations. And there was this race to the bottom where you had 8 states, province of Ontario regulating the fishery. And the best regulations were a reflection of the weakest link there. It was who would over-regulate their commercial fishers if the other jurisdictions weren't. There was no compelling force to have good, consistent regulations across these boundaries. And to make matters worse, there wasn't any science or much science to base those on. That was the divided governance problem. With all those states, the province, lack of regulations, disparate regulations, no two jurisdictions had the same. This race to the bottom mentality was driven by a high level of parochialism in the Great Lakes Basin. So in 1908, after a survey of the late 1800s that the 2 countries, US and Canada, did together, a treaty was proffered between the United States and at the time Great Britain for Canada. And this treaty would have taken away the power of the states and the province and invested it in a binational commission. For a lot of reasons, that treaty went nowhere fast, and it was withdrawn by about 1912. But really the reason is because the states and the province were unwilling to give up their management power, and this treaty was a blatant usurpation of that. Ditto 1946, the problems got worse as the 20th century moved on. And this treaty, same thing. The 1908 treaty would have been all boundary waters between the US and Canada. The 1946 treaty was just the Great Lakes, but it failed for the same reason. That is, the federal governments just simply don't have the authority to manage the freshwater fisheries. It's a state and provincial and later the tribal responsibility. So both of these treaties tried to solve that divided governance problem, and both of them failed. And it did not do anything to improve cross-border management. In fact, the problems got worse. There was no interest in working across borders. Again, why would you give up your authority if the other jurisdictions weren't? We were in a very bad place then by about 1950 in the Great Lakes. because of this divided governance problem. And we were trying to get some sort of cooperation across borders happening, couldn't pull it off, and the fishery was suffering tremendously, and the people who fished economically. And then this invader really put a fine point on the problems that the Great Lakes had. This is a sea lamprey. It's native to the Atlantic Ocean, and it swam its way into the Great Lakes through shipping canals. November 8th of this year marked the 100th anniversary of sea lampreys above Niagara Falls. So they made it past Niagara Falls through the Welland Canal, first seen in Lake Erie in 1921, and their invasion was of the 5 Great Lakes was pretty complete by the mid-1940s. The fishers of the Great Lakes were watching in horror as this invasive species spread. Lampreys attached to fish with a suction cup mouth ring with sharp teeth. And they drill a hole through the scales and skin. It was a perfect storm of invasion because the lamprey had almost unlimited food, and so it was competing with the commercial fishing industry. Almost unlimited spawning habitat, tons of great spawning in the Great Lakes, and then nothing keeping the sea lampreys in check naturally. And they literally changed a way of life in the Great Lakes, and it really jolted the policymakers out of this parochial approach. It needed to be an all hands on deck basin-wide approach to controlling it, because the lamprey spread throughout the system and they didn't observe the political boundaries. So that spurred the governments of Canada and the US to try one more time at a treaty. This one succeeded. It's called the Convention on Great Lakes Fisheries. And it formed my organization, the organization I work for, the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. It gave the commission 2 main responsibilities, primary responsibilities, and that was a science mandate and a sea lamprey control mandate. Science in recognition of the fact that we did not have a lot of science to base decisions on, and then sea lamprey control because somebody needed to take control over this beast and deal with the problem, and it needed to be binational. It would make no sense to have each of the states trying to do it. But what about divided governance? You still have 8 states, province of Ontario, a lack of consistent regulations across the basin. This treaty did not address that directly. Remember, the 2 treaties before it took away that power. This made it very clear that this treaty was not going to take away that power. The savings clause in Article 10 says the commission, that the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, did not have that authority. So it was able to get over the finish line because it specifically said, unlike the other 2 treaties, that the Fishery Commission was not going to be a usurpation of that. And yet divided governance still existed. And we all knew from our history that that was a huge problem. You know, until you had consistent regulations, you were never going to get this race to the bottom dealt with. So the treaty writers sneaked a little provision in it that got no attention, thankfully, and I think probably on purpose too, during the hearings. I've read all the hearings, you know, in the legislatures of Canada and the US that led to our approval of this treaty. And this clause, Article 6, was a nod to the divided governance problem. It said that that the Great Lakes Fishery Commission would help coordinate fishery management. So while we weren't given the authority to regulate, we were to, quote, establish and maintain working arrangements across boundaries. So that was how the divided governance was dealt with. It was a way to work within divided governance as opposed to ending divided governance. And I think that's important to any region that wants to create a cross-border collaborative approach when governments are not going to give up the sovereign power that they have. So that, I want you to keep in mind, please, the history of this, because 2 treaties failed and we were never going to get an agreement that would have taken away the power of the states and the province to manage the fishery. This is how they did it instead. So what is fishery management today in the Great Lakes? Well, we have a commercial, a tribal, and a vibrant recreational fishery. Fishery managers also care very deeply about fish health, to let the fish grow old enough to reproduce, for example, so they can sustain that. And we've created a governance regime then that maintains the authority of the states and the province, but allows them to maximize the ability to work together across borders to do things like sustaining fish stocks and protecting diversity, like every fishery manager, balancing predator prey, using science and good information and data to manage and to balance all of the varying needs. How do we do this? In 1964, to fulfill that establish and maintain working arrangements clause of the treaty, the Great Lakes Fishery Commission formed a committee for each lake. So those are called lake committees, and you see them here. So Lake Superior Committee, Lake Michigan Committee, and so on. These committees are made up of the fishery managers from each of the jurisdictions. So for the sake of simplicity, the Lake Ontario Committee consists of the senior fishery manager for Lake Ontario from the state of New York and the province of Ontario. The Lake Erie Committee is the state of Michigan, the state of Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, and the province of Ontario. And these are the people who are responsible for making decisions about that. Then each of the lake committees is informed by science and work going on by technical committees. So these are people who are in the field doing biology. They would report it up to the lake committees, the science and what's going on in the lake. These lake committee members then would make decisions based on science, but also the socioeconomic needs. And then they agree to take back any decision that they make collectively to their respective jurisdictions and implement them. So no power is taken away from the states or the province or the tribes, but since the decisions that they make are based on their own data collectively, and since they use this process to share information and then reach consensus on what the data is saying, what they agree to is their own collective conclusions. And that heightens the chances then that when they take it back to their own authority to implement it, that they'll be implementing it as they agreed to, because otherwise they'd be essentially ignoring themselves. Now, they're not oblivious to the fact that there are political implications. So just because the lake managers agree on something doesn't necessarily mean that the governor or the DNR director or whatever will. But most of the time, that's the case because it's also the collective opinion of each of the members there. There's a council of lake committees that is made up of all lake committee members that deals with basin-wide issues. And then this Council of Great Lakes Fishery Agencies, this is very important. These are the higher authorities, the chiefs of the fisheries, who sanction and endorse this process. It's very important that you have support from higher ups for them to be saying, you know, cross-border cooperation is important, and you, the lake managers, we expect you to be working with your counterparts across borders. This is important as well, time. You can't just snap your fingers and say you shall work well together. These committees have existed since the mid-1960s. And then in 1981, coming out of a sort of the environmental era that was the 70s, they put this lake committee process on steroids and signed what's called a Joint Strategic Plan for Management of Great Lakes Fisheries. It kept the lake committee process, but it said, we're not only going to use this process to share information, but we're going to use this process to identify our shared goals and objectives, and then carry out those objectives. It's a very important plan because it puts on paper the commitment that each of the states and the province and the tribes have made to each other about how they're going to behave. One of the things, for example, is that they acknowledge that the plan can't be binding or regulatory because that's the individual responsibilities. But if you base it on consensus and identifying your shared objectives, you're going to have a much higher chance that what they come up with is going to be implemented, because they set up a process for collective action. In other words, because this is a strategic plan, not a plan itself, the strategic being they've set up a process to meet regularly, to share information and to come to consensus on the data, and then to put plans forward. That the possibility of it being implemented is significantly heightened. This is very much a plan that focuses on ongoing relationships, and then the outcome being sustainable fisheries. In other words, through the Joint Strategic Plan, what the managers do is they meet regularly, they commit to meeting regularly and to share information, to balance science and politics, and also to develop shared plans and objectives and decide on who's going to do what. A major part of this plan is they've agreed that even though it's consensus based, that if one jurisdiction is going to do something that has a meaningful effect on another jurisdictions, that they not only have to discuss it in this forum, but also reach consensus on it. And that's a very important point. In Lake Erie, by the way, they use this process to set quotas or annual tax for 2 of the big species. So let me just summarize, and then I'll turn it back to Dr. Lawrence for any discussion or questions. Conflict you have to expect in the Great Lakes because you have the province of Ontario, 8 states, and the tribes that manage the fishery. And the question is, have you turned that conflict toward competition or do you use it to cooperate? For most of our history, it was the former. We competed, and that was because of the fact that it was characterized by a lack of information, a low interest in the relationship across borders and the outcome, this race to the bottom. There was unequal power. I didn't talk much about that, but states like Michigan and Ontario were the big players in the game. Cooperation is where we've shifted through this Lake Committee and Joint Strategic Plan process by focusing on the value of the relationships and the outcome. That's characterized by regular interactions, predictability, trust, and so on. I was struck by something that Dr. Racuna said in his presentation a few minutes ago. Lake Victoria Fisheries Organization has existed since 1994, so that's good. This takes time. And also they place a strong value, it seems, Lake Victoria LVFO in plans and policies that the managers then can take back to their governments and say, look, we're basing our decisions on science and good policies. But there's no substitute for the in-person. That's why I end where I started. As we think about coming out of COVID in the coming years, we need to remain true to the fact that working across borders is often a relationship approach as much as it is anything else. But whatever regime you set up has to be reflective of your history and doing what you do based on the realities of your specific situation. But that's how we did it in the Great Lakes, how we got from competition to cooperation. So thank you very much. And back to you, Ted, for any questions people might have.
Great. Dr. Gaden, thank you so much. That's exactly what we were looking for. And I'm glad that you mentioned the Lake Victoria Fisheries Organization there at the end, because the Lake Victoria Fisheries Organization and the Great Lakes Fishery Commission have had a relationship, I believe, since 1994. Certainly when I was at the Fishery Commission beginning around 2004, 2005, the engagement increased, and it's been fair since then. And so we're still trying to find more opportunities for that. We are running a bit late on our schedule, but does anybody have a question for Dr. Gaden to raise your hand and do so? Otherwise, we can do it in the chat. Marc has indicated that he can stay around until almost the end of the meeting, I think. And if there's no specific questions, we would actually like to open up the entire, have all speakers who are still present be available for plenary discussion for the next 10 to 15 minutes before we wrap up. And so I'll pause here for just one moment to see if anybody has a question. And if not, I would like to thank Dr. Gaden. That was great. Thank you so much for being here for that presentation.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And I think we still have a lot to discuss. And hopefully this next year in 2022, we'll all be together physically meeting and discussing more of these. And I think everyone who gave these talks should be there to discuss. We've only scratched the surface with a lot of these questions. And of course, Farida, you didn't raise your hand and speak, but you did put something in the text, and I'll let Marc.
Yeah.
There's actually been a couple of questions, Marc, on aquaculture in the North American Great Lakes, and you might touch on those in the text.
Well, I'm not a huge expert in aquaculture, but there's definitely aquaculture in the Great Lakes region. Most of it is on land, so they would be fish farms on land, and so there are water quality issues related to that. and also with hatcheries, because a lot of the fish of the Great Lakes are supported by hatcheries for either sport purposes or rehabilitation purposes. And then there are some pen aquaculture facilities, mostly around Manitoulin Island in Lake Huron, in Canada, in Ontario. And those are not huge operations, and so they tend to be, depending on who you talk to, okay in terms of the management of those. But there's differing opinions about that. There was some talk a few years ago by some of the states of expanding pen aquaculture in the lakes themselves, and that didn't go over too well. And they for the fact that the lakes are just not big enough, many people think, to do that. But there are others who are very clear that it could be done properly, and so I think that that's something that could happen in the future. Aquaculture, whether it's on land or in pens, is something that's licensed by the subnational jurisdictions, so the states and the province. So it also is acknowledged that if they're going to expand aquaculture in the Great Lakes proper, that there needs to be a collective conversation about it, because it's conceivable that if one state or the province were to expand aquaculture, it could have an effect on another jurisdiction.
Okay.
Indeed. Thank you, Mark. And I think there's some more coming in. Ken Irving, he has one. Maxon, it looks like, I'm not sure if that's on the same issue, but please feel free to answer some of these in the chat, and we're going to hand it over to Steph to facilitate some of the, maybe some more question and answer will come up, Mark.